Welcome to the Messy City Podcast, where we talk with the people who design, plan, build, develop, or even just think about how to create beautiful, successful, and humane cities and towns. Let's learn from each other and create places we truly care about. Welcome back to the Messy City Podcast. This is Kevin Klinkenberg. I've become really fascinated by discussions about zoning, as you might have gathered over the years, and different approaches to thinking about zoning. Zoning in the United States is only about 100 years old, but I think by most people's recognition, people who are in the planning and development world, it's really been a pretty dismal failure. How we zone cities in the United States. And there have been efforts at reform for zoning really going back to the 1970s, if you think about it, with the creation of like planned unit district zoning and many subsequent innovations. One of the conversations that's intrigued me for some time has been part of the strong towns notion about thinking about how neighborhoods could enable like the next level of change automatically. And this is a subject I've been really interested in, and I'm really happy to have somebody on the show today who has thought even more deeply about this and written about it. So I want to welcome Andrew Burleson onto the podcast. Thanks for joining, Andrew.
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. Happy to be here.
So Andrew wrote a post on his Substack called The Post-Suburban Future recently that really caught my attention. He has a bunch of really great pieces on there. Before I get in that, I do think it'd be helpful to know, just for the listeners, Andrew, who are you? Who is Andrew Burleson?
Yeah, so I am a co-founder and the board chair of Strong Towns. I've been the board chair since 2014, which is kind of when we incorporated in our current structure. And I'm maybe a little bit of an unusual person. I live kind of a forked life. I spend quite an enormous percentage of my time doing advocacy work through Strong Towns and here locally in Denver. But it's not my day job. I work in financial technology by day, so I kind of have these two worlds, and this is one of them.
Some of us would say that that's the intelligent way to go about it. You actually have like a real career, a job outside of all this world, and then you spend your other time instead of like letting the advocacy thing overcome your life.
Yeah, well, it's there's certainly trade-offs. I will say, so I started out, I have an undergrad in architecture and a master's in real estate. And I had the great timing of graduating into the fall of 2007.
Oh, perfect.
And trying to be a developer. Yeah, and it didn't work. I ended up working in Houston in urban planning for a couple years, and then working in consulting for a couple years. And at one point, one of my bosses told me, he said, I think you need to consider if your vocation and your avocation need to be the same thing. And I think he wanted me to quit all the advocacy stuff that I was doing that was, kind of risky for him from a business point of view. And I went the other direction instead. I kind of got out of this as my day job and concentrated on CNU at first and then Strong Towns since then. And, I think that's worked out, but it definitely has trade-offs. I mean, I feel a little bit of mental fatigue sometimes from like the amount of context switching, but but it's been pretty good.
Well, and there's always that opportunity for you to get back into the development world.
So one day soon, I hope.
Yeah. I know you've got small children too, so that's something else we may talk about here as we go on. So I really want to dive into this post and give it the appropriate time for you to talk about it because you put a ton of thought and effort into this. The specific post that you wrote was called, Could We Create Land Use Rules That Work Better for Everyone? And it was your thoughts about something you call an adaptive zoning code. So I think maybe the place to start, Andrew, is talk a little bit about what is the problem. Like, what's the problem you're trying to diagnose and solve before we get into the meat of what an adaptive code is.
Yeah, sure. So I will point out as we start that I had to make a great effort to never use the word zoning in anything that I because it's not about zoning actually. And I will say part of this is the fact that my professional experience was all concentrated in Houston. Um, I think zoning is we usually use zoning as shorthand to mean land use regulation in
Sure.
general.
Yeah. Hmm.
But really, zoning is the specific act of coloring a map and saying, like, this zone, this geographic boundary can contain these uses, and that geographic boundary. Almost all of the rules operate independently of the map. The map says which sets of rules apply, but the rules exist independent of the map.
Hmm.
And when you live and work in Houston, you live that because Houston has everything but the map. Um, so just to say, the idea is adaptive code, and yeah. So I'll try not to say zoning as we go, but just I don't want anyone to be confused about.
No, that's
Uh,
fair. Fair
yeah,
enough. That's a good point.
I've gotten myself in trouble. I have told people I don't think we need zoning, and what I mean is I don't think the map is mandatory, and then they get very off on the wrong track of that. I think something like no rules of any kind, which is not what
Yeah.
I would say. But in any case, okay, you asked what is the problem? Um, oh man, where do we start? Well, I know your audience would know. The last 100 years or so, we've gotten very bad at making cities, and if you think about why, um, when we go back to the early 1900s, really all the way to the 1930s, and you look at so many of the beautiful places that we built around the United States, you would see, well, how did we create these places? There's this silly meme online of, the ancient city planner says, I gave you a grid and a park at the center, build whatever you want. And
Yeah.
the modern city planner goes on this like 3-paragraph diatribe about whether or not the like bird egress requirements from the roof have been met. And okay, so what did that road look like? Well, we started with a fairly simple and straightforward idea, which is that we could benefit from some city planning. Some top down planning could produce better results than just a totally organic free for all. And actually, I think that's true. I think we see from the very beginning cities that started with an intentional grid and intentionally spaced parks around, and had some amount of pattern to how they were growing. Like that turned out well. You look at Savannah or
Yep.
the old city of Philadelphia, or famously the Commissioner's Plan in New York. Like some of those
Yep.
efforts really created a framework that helped the city grow well.
Absolutely.
Um, so that's a great idea. Let's build on that more. What do we have? What is our problem in the late 1800s? Well, we have industrial pollution that we're not a big fan of. It's interesting. The very first cities that adopted what we think of as the sort of precursor of today's zoning were actually in Germany, and they started banning industrial development from sort of the central city areas, not as much because they were focused on pollution, but because they were worried about the price of housing. Some of these fast growing
Hmm.
industrial cities saw that industrialists were raising huge amounts of capital and buying up all the land to build giant factories, and there was like nowhere left for people to build anything else. And so
Hmm.
they wanted to sort of say, hey, there's a whole lot of land that's going to not be subject to that. It's kind of like today's, it's not the same, but today people are starting to worry about institutional investors buying single family homes, and they're afraid that like those guys will just outcompete everybody, right? But that was really happening. That's, I would say, the institutional investor thing is exaggerated today, but the industrialist thing in late 1800s Germany was pretty real. So to some extent, they were solving a market pricing problem, but it had a nice benefit of it also reduced pollution in the neighborhoods. So as you get closer to the 1930s and 40s, you start to see a real embrace of this idea. Let's have a map. Let's have a map that says we're going to put this here, we're going to put that there, and it's going to make sense. It's going to be orderly and rational, and that's going to make the city better. And I think there are, like I said, I think there are some positives there. But what's really unfortunate is that we combined this with our same mid-century moment of going all in on cars as this is the way that everyone is going to live. Everyone is going to have one car per adult, drive everywhere they go, everywhere for every trip. That's the future. That's mobility. That's freedom. That's what it's going to look like. And as part of that, we've got to spread everything out. and we've got to sort of like reorient our cities. We've got to, and this starts with the subdivision requirements around curvilinear streets and not having four-way intersections, and tying that to the 30-year mortgage. So you start to have the government play this very large role that I would describe as social engineering,
Mm-hmm.
saying we have a vision of the future. It's how we want people to live, and we're going to like stack all the incentives to create that.
Mm-hmm.
Um, then, of course, you get into the mid-century period and urban renewal and everything else, and we've just completely radically transformed our cities. And since then, I caught part of your last or recent episode with Seth Zarin. You guys talked about, there was this reaction against this radical change. The cities are being decimated. Jane Jacobs speaks up and says, like, this stuff's crazy. This got to stop.
Mm-hmm.
And the mood we were in the 70s was to proceduralize everything.
Right.
So it was not, and it's unfortunate, it was not to question like, well, why don't we just stop urban renewal? It was more like, okay, when we do these things, let's make sure we do them the right way.
Yeah.
Which I think was I think that was like where we went really wrong. So since then, you've seen cities add more and more and more rules and regulations to control everything. And it depends on where you are. Every city has a different stack, but they all kind of rhyme. They all kind of rhyme where, the city determines exactly what kind of business can go in exactly which kind of place, and more perniciously, exactly what kind of house can be built in every single, and it's down to sometimes the level of exactly how large your yard needs to be, exactly, can this front yard be 20 feet or does it need to be 22 feet setback? And it's like a level of micromanagement that makes it quite difficult to build. And so we've arrived at today where building anything is a highly discretionary activity and a highly professionalized activity, where almost all of the effort going into building things is about getting permission to build things. And you end up with a lot of just weird distortions related to that. Since getting permission is so hard, then you really incentivize professional development or the incentives that professional developers face is to scale.
Right.
I'm going to have a 3-year permitting battle. I want to get 1,000 units out of that battle, not 100 units or 10 units or 1 unit. And when you say it takes a similar amount of effort to build one duplex as it does to build one high rise, well, then anyone whose business is to build buildings is going to try to build high rises if they can. And that's what you see. You see developers, even the ones who start small, it kind of from day one, they're like attempting to sort of climb this scale ladder where they can build larger and larger developments so that they can leverage that entitlement cost and amortize it over more units. And people don't love this. It gets us in this point of stasis where there's hardly any change. And when there is change, it's a sudden and dramatic change from what we're used to. You see that, people don't build homes like the ones that are in the neighborhood today. They build something that's much larger and much more expensive, and these huge discontinuities. We have, in our major metro areas, there's a pretty broad consensus that we have a housing shortage. I've experienced that living in San Francisco and watching the way people's lives were just stuck. And when you get back down to it, it's all essentially this system. Like, what is the system that creates space for people to live? And how is that system working? And I would say right now it's not working very well. So that was maybe a longer history than you asked for. But I think that's
That's great.
The problem is the entire system. So it takes a little bit of context to think about what is it we're trying to fix.
And I think it's interesting because, if I had to step back and if I were to have this conversation with people who are not in the planning, development, real estate world, they might just say, well, okay, if we need new housing, you just go build more housing. Like,
right.
That's not so hard, is it? You just, if you want to build some stuff, you just go build it. And people don't realize that we've engineered this process that makes it much harder than I think most people realize.
Yeah.
And perhaps the most regulated industry in America when you get right down to it at every level. So I do want to fixate a little bit on, there's a word you use that I think is really appropriate, and that is stasis.
Yeah.
And you use this in the article, and you mentioned it now. I'm interested in this because I think if I were to take it down a different tack a little bit, human beings themselves are always changing. And we grow old, everything changes, you have kids, whatever. You go through the whole cycle of birth, life, death, etc. The nature of us are always changing, but we have created this model through our land use regulations that basically encourages everything to stay the same or have this kind of stasis component. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about maybe how that works in reality.
Um, yeah, I mean, well, okay. So there's sort of two sides to this. One is the the sim- the way it works in reality is not that complicated. Most cities' zoning code says what you can build, and what it says is you can build exactly the same thing that's there now. And well, there's already something there now, so you're not going to build anything. Um, it doesn't really make sense to tear down a house and then rebuild a house that's exactly the same house. Now, I mean, you see in places that have extraordinary housing pressure that people will tear down old houses and build larger ones.
Mhm.
But it sort of depends on whether you're allowed to do that. I mean, you go to some cities and they actually say, yes, we only have tiny houses here now, and you're only allowed to have tiny houses here now in the future. And so you don't see a lot of tear downs unless, a structure has just for some reason, burned down or completely fallen apart or something like that. Um, so it's not economical to change anything. And then when it's not economical to change anything, then you end up with sort of two most likely paths. If the area you're in has a dynamic economy, then you trend towards stifling exclusion. That's Palo Alto, California.
Mhm.
You could have bought a home there as a professor in the 50s, and now you need to be a billionaire with a B.
Mhm.
And that's tough. Maybe not literally a billionaire, but you have many, many millions of dollars to buy the
Right.
homes that were just
Right.
ordinary, people who worked at Stanford, no big deal, a couple generations ago. Um, the other direction is if there's nothing, if your economy is not very dynamic, then you trend towards deterioration and decay. Like you actually accelerate the sort of stifling of the economy because in a neighborhood that's like kind of sleepy and there's not going along, someone might have an idea. Oh well, I feel like we could use a little corner coffee shop right here, and I'm just going to open it in my garage. There'll just be room for 3 customers and one patio table, and I just feel like that'll serve my neighborhood. Okay, that's the kind of thing that could potentially take a neighborhood that's very quiet and maybe struggling a little bit and inject a little bit of new life. Or okay, you've got an older couple who their kids are, you know, trying to get on their feet and they think to themselves, well, we'd love maybe we can do a multi-generational thing. We'll put a cottage in the back and our kids can live there when they're in their 20s until they kind of get established, and then maybe one day they'll take the big house and we'll take the cottage. Okay, but you can't do that, so people move away instead.
Yeah.
And it's tough. The market is incredibly complex. Cities are complex. People are complex. You can't just say like, okay, these rules mean that a place is dying, or these rules mean that a place is like squeezing everybody out, and there's no other factors. No, there are other factors, but it's how the rules interact with all those other complex factors that we can now look back and observe over the last 50 years in particular. It's not producing the outcomes we want.
Yeah. And if I were to use like a Midwestern example, just thinking about my own city here in Kansas City, I can think about places that were built immediately after World War II, which, people might have an image in their head of like kind of the typical like 3 bedroom, 1 bath ranch house, 1,000 square feet, and whole neighborhoods built like that, right out, in the 1950s in particular. So we have, uh, to kind of take your point, I can think of one location that is in a really considered a very good school district that has those kinds of homes, and but it's considered a desirable area. And so what people have been doing the last 20 years is buying those small houses, tearing them down, and
Right.
building $1 million houses, as a replacement. Um, and recently, that same jurisdiction tried to like allow for accessory dwelling units and other things, and it was really shot down.
Hmm.
Uh, I can think of a place on the opposite side of the metro area with the exact same houses, but in an unfavored school district and considered a less desirable area, and it's just been in a cycle of decay for
Right.
30 years. and to really all sorts of social dysfunction. And a lot of that, I think, speaks to exactly what you said. In the declining area, people, as people got older, and their kids maybe moved out of the house, there might have been the desire on some people's part to, yeah, have a little cottage in the back that maybe they could move into in retirement, and the kids could come back and take the whole house. But you can't do it. You're not allowed to do it. The neighborhood's not allowed to change without great effort. And so as a result, the easy thing to do is for people to just eventually, like one by one, just abandon it.
Right.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think this kind of speaks like maybe what I should have said earlier is like this notion of stasis is kind of a false notion because neighborhoods are never stable. They're
Yeah,
always changing in some fashion. They're either getting better or they're getting worse. They're getting older. They're getting younger, and yet our
that's
land
right.
use regulations kind of lock everything into place.
Well, and it's what you said. Humans are always changing. We always experience growth and evolution and change in our lives. And I like one like slightly pithy thing I like to say is the character of the neighborhood is the people, not the buildings. Well, the people are changing no matter what you do. Like
Right.
that's happening,
Right.
right? You can say that that's normal and healthy, and therefore the buildings will adjust and flex and change a little bit over time as the people experience change. Or you can say the buildings are not allowed to change, and what has to change is the people. And what that ends up meaning is that when people's life circumstances change, they have to go somewhere else. And they do. I mean, they do. Like you know, you see in a lot of my family's from Central Texas, you see a lot of uh, uh, rolling waves of school openings and closures because it's somehow we don't really have multi-generational neighborhoods. We have everyone is like 25 and just got married and they move into the house at the same time in 1980, and then all those people have all those kids, and then they can't have enough schools and they try to build them all. This is not just Austin. This is a lot of it's the
Mhm.
Sun Belt, but and then that neighborhood 30, 40 years later, they've got all this school capacity and all this everything, and but the population is getting old and they're angry about the school taxes because they don't have any more kids. And meanwhile, 10 miles down the highway, they like can't build enough schools fast enough. They're overcrowded with and it's like, can we not, this is a really expensive way for us to sort of organize our society versus having neighborhoods that sort of could span multiple generations and have more. And so it's interesting because stability is, I think, what we actually want, like a degree of stability.
Yeah.
And interestingly, requiring stasis in the built environment actually works against stability in the sort of broader human life. But it's really easy to think that the stasis is helping you get stability. And you have to like observe a little bit more closely to realize actually it's working against it.
Yeah. All right. So let's talk about then your thought process on this idea of an adaptive code. Maybe talk about where that origin of that came from and
Yeah.
how you see that working.
Yeah. So, okay. Well, I want to just like frame this with an appropriate dose of humility up front. This is an idea. This is not a. I'm not here to tell you about the exciting new model from some cool, really innovative city. Um, so, so take that as a starting point. This is an idea that I've been chewing on for a long time, and am trying to see if we could develop it into something that could be useful. I started thinking about this when I was working in urban planning in Houston. As I mentioned, Houston doesn't have a zoning map. Um, there are a lot of wonderful things about Houston. It's relatively a free and permissive place, but it still has all the rules that require. Well, it's less today. They have made some progress, to be fair. But in the late aughts, I would have told you, Houston has everything but the zoning map. They have the big setbacks. They have in most of the city, not the inner loop at that point, but most of the city, the large lot sizes, the overly wide roads, the dead end cul-de-sacs, all of that. And so actually it's interesting because it's pretty hard to tell the difference. You drive around Houston and you drive around Miami and it's like, well, I like, okay, there's more palm trees in Miami, but not that much. It's really humid. You roll down your windows. It's like not actually that easy to tell which city you're in.
Mhm.
Um, so it's kind of like Houston is humid Los Angeles, but it doesn't have the zoning. So how well, shouldn't it look different? Well, actually, those form-based elements are what really determine how the place is going to look and feel. What's different in Houston is that if someone buys a piece of land, they can essentially get right to work on building. They need to submit a plan to the city, and the city needs to approve. They still have building codes. They still have, like I said, all those. But what they'll say is, okay, we've decided we're going to build a couple office buildings, and here's how we've met the setbacks. Here's how we've met the parking requirements. Here's how we've met the height regulations. If depending on where you're building, they may apply. You know, and as long as what you've done conforms to that sort of form uh, requirements, then you can just do it. Now, Houston also has a bunch of nuisance rules. So if the thing you want to build is a gun range, well, you can't just do that. That has to have, like, I think it's a, I'm saying from memory, so I might be wrong, but if I remember right, it's like a 3,000 foot buffer zone between your gun range and any other development, which I don't really know how far bullets go if you miss the target you're aiming at, but that
Yeah.
seems, I imagine they checked. I don't know. But like, it makes enough sense, right? You don't want anybody to live next door to a gun range by surprise. So, and they have a lot of other common sense rules like that. So the result is that you get this, like, a lot of this really organic development activity, but and mostly I think that's good, but the form of it is still kind of bad. And when you get really jarring discontinuities, sometimes it gets really complicated. So while I was living and working there, there was this project called the Ashby High Rise. And essentially, there was a low rise apartment building in a wealthy neighborhood. The developer had bought it and wanted to build a 20 something story luxury condos there. And actually, from the point of view of the housing market, it makes sense. Like, that's an area that tons of people would love to live. It's got all the classic, highly desirable neighborhood characteristics. It's fully built out in the center of the city. There's no new, there's no new land to expand horizontally onto. So you're not going to be able to create new giant houses with big yards. You're going to have to do something different. And this developer realized, there's probably a lot of people who would love to live in the middle of this neighborhood and would accept living in a kind of a medium-sized condo in lieu of a single-family home because it'll be a third the price. And that'll be great. So developer bought the land, and by the rules, they're allowed to just do it. But the neighborhood hated this and managed to sue it into limbo. And I don't know if it's actually finally started, but the last time I checked, it had been like 12 or 13 years
Oh, wow.
and still wasn't under construction, which for Houston is like a shocking, like, that's
Yeah.
not usually how things go there. And so all this was going on. I was busy helping organize the CNU Houston chapter. I was getting really interested in form-based codes, and I was just thinking about, like, why is it that people are reacting so strongly? We have this laissez-faire culture. It's like
Hmm.
probably the best thing we have going for us. And also, there's a lot of other neighborhoods that are pretty nice nearby where this high-rise condo thing has happened in the neighborhood, and they're, like, fine. I mean, I understand why people don't love them, but, like, the sky didn't fall, right? So, like, why did this one trigger such an intense reaction? And so I started thinking about, could Houston preserve its sort of permissive, you can pretty much build stuff culture, but get better buildings? And so go to, like, a form-based code. Could you do it without a zoning map? Could you do it without city planners? Because Houston's rejected zoning multiple times. They're not going to do that. And somehow, without a zoning map, could you stop projects from happening that people just hate, that trigger a big backlash, while still being generally very permissive? And the answer is, I think you can. Actually, I think it's not even that hard of an idea. What you want to do is say that we have two big ideas. One is that what is allowed to be built is determined as a function of the surrounding conditions. So when I say a function, now my other life is in software, so I think of algorithms and computer
Hmm.
science things a lot. But you could think of this as just like algebra, right? If you have a function x plus 1, well, I don't know what that function will output unless I know what x is. But if the function is x plus 1 and x is 1, then we get 2, right? This is, like, pretty simple, right? So what if we said, instead of having, our illustrious bureaucrats from the central authority hand down to us from on high the map, what if, you can see how my worldview leaking out there, my little snark. What if instead of having our city planners draw a map, we just said, okay, look, if everything around you is one story, then you can just build 2 stories by right, like automatically. You can just that's the function, right? You can always go plus 1 floor. Now, that's too simple. That's probably not the right function to govern. There's a lot that function is answering one question, not lots of other questions. But you could think of that and say, well, what about setbacks? Okay, well, what if if the height function is you can build, or maybe instead of saying plus 1 story, you say plus 50%, or plus 100% rounded down, or something like that. You could find a formula that produces change, but that change is sort of contextual to what's around it and not radical. So similarly, if you said everyone in this street has 20-foot setbacks today, well, let's say that you can go up from there to 15, or you can come closer to the street by 5 feet, something like that. So your function for setbacks would be your neighbors minus 5 feet. Okay. The second idea here is, in addition to determining what's allowed as a function of the surrounding conditions, the second idea is succession by right. So the function says you can go up from here, or you can go a little bit bigger from where you are now, and that's not discretionary. Like you can just do it. So in the same way that most projects in Houston, you submit your plans, and those plans are conforming to the form requirements, they can, for the most part, be built. I mean, again, you have to pass this inspections. It's not a free for all.
Mm-hmm.
But you're not really debating whether or not you're allowed to build an office building. You're just debating whether or not you met the requirements for an office building. And that's a very different conversation. So I think this idea of determine what's allowed from the surrounding conditions and allow the next increment by right, that I wrote this down once in a moleskin, and I brought it to CNU in, I think in West Palm Beach, and passed this around and got a lot of comments from people, and kind of convinced myself that there was something to this. And then that's right about the time that I kind of forked my life and was very busy, making a living and doing something completely different, and working very hard on trying to grow strong towns and help support Chuck and the team and all the great work that they're doing. So I didn't really pursue it a whole lot after that. But I think at a certain point, we started to incorporate this idea of next increment by right into what we're doing at Strong Towns, into our housing toolkits, and our sort of how we talk about advocacy. And more recently, I feel like it's kind of felt to me like it's time to come back to that idea and try to develop it more seriously. Try to find places that would be interested in trying sort of aspects of this or elements of this and see how they work, like actually battle test some of this,
Mm-hmm.
find, can we make something work? And so to that end, that's why I've started writing about it again and trying to explore it further.
Yeah. So, I'm really glad you did, because I think, I've talked about this before on the podcast, like that kernel of an idea of allowing the next increment by right. And the sort of corollary that you all talk about in Strong Towns is that every neighborhood should be able to change a little, but not have to endure massive change,
Right.
at least in a certain window of time. Both of those, I think, are really compelling. And what I have always struggled with my just very practical brain is like, okay, that's great. Now, how exactly do you do that? Because I mean, change is the natural condition for cities. Even if you think to like an extreme example, I mean, Manhattan Island used to largely be single family homes, and at one point in its history, and then it very quickly changed and rapidly developed and became a townhouse city, and then a walk-up apartment city, and then a high-rise city, and so those increments and that change do happen. So one of the things you did in the article then is you took this notion of a sort of incremental change and fleshed it out even more with an example looking at a certain block, a hypothetical block in Denver. Why don't you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Yeah. So one thing I actually, this is, I'm this kind of nerd. One of the reasons I moved here is because Denver has 2 interesting things. One is it has a principally form-based code for the city. It is still zoning based, so it is the
Mhm.
city staff draw the map, and we debate the map, and you have to change the map if you want to do anything. different. But within the map, the rules are principally form based. And I think those rules produce generally good buildings. The second thing is that Denver has the only fragment that I'm aware of, although there probably are some others, but this is one I'm aware of what I would call an adaptive rule, which is the Denver setback rule is you can build to the street the same distance that your neighbors on either side did. And this is really interesting because what you see with new development around the city is that you sort of get this effect of sort of uniform street frontages, even when you have new buildings, even though the historic fabric of Denver has cities at all kinds of different setbacks all over the place. Um, so that rule produces that particular outcome. Now, I would say we should be, I like buildings closer to the street, so I think we should say like your neighbors plus a couple feet.
Mm-hmm.
But still, like I just find it very fascinating that the Denver zoning code has actually adopted a little a little fragment of this. Look at the neighbors, and you can do what they did. Um, they just are missing the increment. Okay, so the example I looked at, and what we would talk about here is a succession function. So I kind of made up an example of a block with a few different houses on it, and you could say, let's suppose that our succession function was you can build one story higher than your surrounding neighbors. Okay, all of the neighbors around you are one story homes. Okay, you can build a two-story home just by right. You don't have to debate anything about it. What if you have a mix? You have two-story on one side, one story on the other side. Well, you could say you could build up to uh, the average, and maybe you round the average down. So if you're just looking at those two properties, the average would be like 1.5 stories, and you can build that average rounded down, so 1 plus 1, so you come up to 2. So you end up building a two-story home, same as the one on your left, and one story taller than the one on your right. The block in this case is like hypothetical, but it illustrates ways you can think about this. So one question is like, who are your neighbors? Like, what is the surrounding context you could take into account? Denver's setback rule, it is principally just the properties on either side of you, but there are some call outs. One is that if one of those is a corner lot, they don't count corner lots. I actually don't know why, but I assume it's because it's just complicated. Oftentimes corner lots orient towards the other street, not the street that you're facing. So maybe your front setback is their side setback. So whatever, they just said, okay, we don't count corners. So if you have a corner lot on the right, then you look at the two houses to the left instead of the one on either side. They also have this rule that if there's if the house on one side of you is considered an outlier, and they have a function that basically says like, if every house on the block has a 20-foot setback and except one, and that one has no setback at all, then you can't use that house as your precedent because it's an outlier, and instead you have to like skip over that one and do the one next to that. Okay, that's all very interesting. I don't have like a recommendation for what the formula should be, but what I would recommend is that we should be debating that. We should be debating the rules and not debating the individual projects. Because I think what we could do, I think we could say, here is a description of surrounding conditions that are common in our community, and when these conditions exist, here's what we define as a reasonable degree of next increment. And let's just allow that. Let's just explicitly say, when these are the surrounding conditions, here's how much bigger you can go. Here's how much you can go from single family to duplex, or you can go from duplex to fourplex, or whatever, right? And I don't think there's one magical formula that works for everyone or works for every place, but I do think that each community could come up with a formula that they felt good about, and that they felt like, hey, this produces change that makes sense to us. It's allowing flexibility, it's allowing incremental growth, it's allowing change, and but it's not inflicting radical change. I think sometimes like I will speak a little bit to, I have a lot of YIMBY friends who like I wouldn't quite call myself a YIMBY, almost, but not quite. And I run into some of them and they're like, oh, but that's terrible because what we need is to just be allowed to build infinite housing everywhere. Okay, well, first of all, that's going to produce backlash and it's not going to stand politically. So like, that's just not going to happen. But actually, most YIMBYs I know are very pragmatic about this and kind of say, okay, sure, but we need to push for bigger. And what I will try to point out is, and I think Seth Zarin mentioned this on the recent recording you did with him. I ran an example in Denver or I did the math in Denver, there's 20,000 blocks approximately in the city and about 20 homes on each block or 20 buildings on each block. Okay, if you just said we have one backyard cottage per year per block gets added to the city, that's 20,000 homes a year. The
Mhm.
Denver Regional Council of Governments has estimated that there's about a 50,000 unit shortage of housing in the Denver metro. Not the city is only a small percentage of the metro, but the entire metro area. So the city of Denver in 2.5 years with two and a half you don't split in half, so let's just go to 3 years, three backyard cottages scattered across every block in the city would completely erase the housing deficit here.
Yeah.
So I think when
And
you think
nobody
about
would
like,
even really notice.
and nobody would even really notice.
Yeah.
So I think that's the power of thinking, what is an increment of change that we could all get behind and feel like this is normal, this is healthy, this is fine, this will work. um, and if we unlock that everywhere in aggregate, that makes a huge difference.
Yeah, and I think another thing aspect of this that really interests me is what you're really focusing on and talking about are sort of the regular like neighborhood blocks that occur in most cities, and because that's the scale where we've made everything incredibly hard, just like the scale of the individual who gets a mortgage, who can do
Right.
something, and yet if you actually want to scale change successfully, it's got to appeal because 60% or more of people own their own homes
Right.
in almost every market in the country. That's a whole lot of people that can get a mortgage. If they can get a mortgage, they can probably figure out a way to convert a space in the house, add a little space, maybe add a backyard cottage, etc., to enable that change. But right now, in most places, the rules make that incredibly difficult to do, or just very opaque in such a way that people are like, well, that's too complicated. I don't have the time to think about it, time to deal with it, so I'm just not going to bother.
Right. So yeah, I would say to me, one of the goals is to deprofessionalize development. Right now, as long as development is principally a professional endeavor, then we're not really going to have uh, a broadly inclusive, upwardly mobile housing supply in the way that we do for many other things. Like if you, and I mean, this is not like a perfect example, but if you think about, if you think about, I don't know, the restaurant business. Okay, it's a competitive business. It's highly regulated. You've got to pass the safety inspections and everything else. But like, if you just want to open a food truck or a taco stand or like sell some tamales at a farmer's market, there's entry level activity there that allows people. You don't have to be a professional and go raise capital to get a
Right.
10,000 square foot restaurant building in order to just sort of start up that ladder. And in fact, the vast majority in most cities, the vast majority of food service establishments or like small retail usually are just like little tiny spaces in old buildings with small tenants. Those are they're much easier to fill and they stay full more. Every place you go, you see these big retail on the corner, especially when it's the new apartment buildings that have retail on the ground floor, and that retail just sits vacant forever. Why does that retail sit vacant? Well, one aspect is the financing. They can't lower the rent as much as they really probably should in order to clear. But even if they did that, it's hard to get credit-worthy tenants who they're going to need to do a lot of improvement on the space in order to sort of actually open a business in there. That requires a lot of capital. You just don't have that many tenants who can do that. So it's just tough.
Yeah.
If you say, what kind of business can you run out of your garage? I mean, the barrier to entry is so low. Like you could do
Yeah.
just about anything, like, and it doesn't have to be a huge success to work. So similarly with housing, the ability to say, I'm an empty nester in a 4-bedroom home. I'd really like some extra cash flow. I don't want to move. I have more house than I know what to do with, but I love my community. I'm deeply rooted here. Why do we make it hard for you to rent out a spare bedroom? Like, why? Like, what is that helping? What is that preserving?
Or
Well,
convert a piece of the house to a bedroom with a kitchenette. You know.
right. Yeah.
Yeah.
You got 2 bedrooms and you could take one of them and make it into a little living room with a kitchenette. The second one stays a bedroom. It's got a bathroom attached. You've carved off a third of your house. A lot of houses have floor plans where that would actually be very feasible. And if you've got a window, the window could be a door.
Yeah.
So like you could have a separate entry. You could even close off the interior circuit. It's not that hard to convert. And this is, you said at the beginning, people look at housing issues and they say, oh, we don't have enough housing. Well, isn't that easy? Just build more. And they're right and they're wrong. Actually, it is easy to just build it's not difficult to find a contractor in your town who could very easily just build up a house
Hmm.
or convert a house into a duplex or whatever. Like all those things are physically easy. They're not as cheap as I wish they were, but they're physically straightforward. Um, but most of it's illegal. So,
Yeah.
like that's the problem.
I want to go back to you. I think you said something that is really, really important in this notion about deprofessionalizing housing. And this, because I think a lot of people really miss this. Especially those of us who are in the housing space, who are our professionals, we still have this notion that, we can work with the professional planners and the bankers and the contractors and the architects, and the professionals can solve this problem because if we just get the rules right, then we can build enough housing to make it happen. But I think what you're saying is that's unlikely or maybe never going to happen or never going to scale. And I can see that because there's only so many of us, first of all. There's only so many projects that any of us can undertake at any given time. And there's only so much like big sources of capital to fund all those things.
Right.
So that's really important. So like enabling the millions and millions of people who just are able to, because they have a job or they have enough money they can get a mortgage, enable them to make that change. That really is the swarm. That is the group of
Right.
people that if you can enable that change, then change will scale.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think it's important to understand all of the professionals need to pay their own bills. Like everyone
Right.
who's working in all of that chain of professionals involved in the production of space for people to do stuff, they all have kids who want to go to college, right? Like, so everyone needs a cut. And if you add up all the people and all the labor that goes into all the buildings, it is a very significant fraction of the price. So when we're dealing with affordability and upward mobility difficulty in a lot of the country, let's talk about also briefly. I would say there's a couple cities in the Midwest that have done some pioneering work on pre-approved plans. South Bend and I think Muskegon, Michigan.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so there's lots in those towns that are just sitting there. No one's using them. If you are today in most cities in America, someone who sees, oh, there's a vacant lot and it's, you know, that that neighborhood seems okay to me. It's got, I just need a place to start. I need a starter home. I need a place to get off the ground. Oh, I could afford that lot. Maybe I could do a custom home. Okay, now you start going down the road of what does it take to actually get a custom home built, and it's a multi-year project that involves all of this red tape. And while you certainly can get through it, I think the really hard part is you talk to a city planner, they're like, well, it's not that hard. You
Right.
just do these
Right.
17 steps, and like that project is allowed. It's not complicated. Like you'll get approval at every one of these
And
17
we'll
meetings
work
you
with
have to
you and
attend.
we'll help you out. Yeah.
Yeah, we'll totally help you out. But like you've lost me at there's 17 meetings to attend. Like I don't have time for that. So what I love in cities that have adopted pre-approved plans is that you're saying you should be able to say, "Hey, I've got this lot and I could go down to City Hall and I could kind of pick from the catalog and just say, "Okay, I'll take that one." This house plan is, 1500 square feet. It's plenty for me. I can afford it. And what's really ideal if you start to scale that idea up is you start to say, okay, now there's an ecosystem of local builders who have probably built that house a dozen times by now. They can give you a very confident quote on exactly how much it will cost and how long it will take to build. And you could buy the lot today and start construction tomorrow. That's how easy it should be.
Yeah.
By the way, that's still not trivial. You're not going to have every person on earth go start building everything custom from scratch. But right now you have no one ever do that. And I think like that's the kind of thing we have to think about. Why um you know why is housing so expensive? There's many contributing factors, but one factor is that it's quite hard to bring supply onto the market for any reason other than to make a 20% return on equity.
Right.
So if you started to have supply coming onto the market that was more for people's personal use, then that consideration is different. And you take out, so if a percentage of the market could sort of be satisfied without the profit margins for all the professionals along the way, and that supply is coming online for 20 or 30% lower prices, well, like that's a healthier market. Like
Right.
that's creating some options for, but also because right now the the housing market is almost entirely built by professionals as products for sale to the broad market, you end up with a lot of risk aversion. So around the country right now, we have tons and tons of studio apartments, 1 bedroom and 2 bedroom apartments. We have very few 3 bedroom apartments. Why? Well, the developers have kind of all looked at this and said, well, the largest section of people who rent houses is singles and couples. So studios and 1 bedrooms are the vast majority. And a few people want an extra bedroom. There's this huge mismatch. It's kind of obvious that if you built an apartment with more 3 bedroom units, that there would be people who would want that. But why would you want to take that risk if you're the developer? You kind of want to target like the most mainstream,
Right.
highest volume thing so that you have the best chance of it just being easy. If you de-professionalize a little bit, you create more opportunity for more people to take smaller risks instead of saying, well, I've got to decide the unit mix for this 400 unit mega complex. Like, no, I'm just going to build one. I built a house for myself. It went really well. And, I think that I might build a duplex next door because I'm pretty sure there's a lot of people who would like to live in this neighborhood if there was a few more units available. And you can take a chance, and like the ability of a lot more people to take a lot more chances, and some of them won't work, but those small bets create the kind of flexibility and adaptability that allow places to respond to the needs of the people on the ground, and where you could actually say, okay, I don't know if there's market demand for 400 3 bedroom units in this neighborhood, but I know there's market demand for one, or two, and I could do it. Like I could go down to City Hall and get a pre-approved plan. Or if we go back to an adaptive code model and we're going to innovate and say, like, I want to build something a little different than hasn't been done before. Well, instead of having this uncertainty of whether you can survive discretionary approval, you should be able to say, okay, I'm in a surrounding context that's a mix of single family and duplexes. Okay, so a triplex here, our succession function says that you can go up to 4 units. So a triplex is fine. Um, it's one less. I could go to a fourplex, but I feel like a 3 unit. I've got this idea in my head for this design. Okay, here's my setback. Here's my height requirement. Here's the functional form-based rules I need to meet. I can just hire an architect. I don't have to get a zoning attorney.
Mm-hmm.
I can like bring my plan into City Hall. I can quickly go down the checklist of did it meet the requirements for this context? Yes. Okay, and I am entitled and ready to build within a week or two instead of within or architectural design time plus a few days, right? And I have my permit and I'm ready to construct, and now I can go grab my contractor and get to work. That just unlocks so much more ability for so many more people who are the much smaller scale uh, local investors, local people who want to contribute to their community to try things and to try and solve needs they see in their community that maybe don't scale. Like maybe the individual need, maybe the individual circumstance, it can't be replicated at the size of a giant condo tower or a big new subdivision on the edge of town, but absolutely can fit 3 or 4 little buildings in your community and make your community so much stronger because it meets the needs of the people who live there.
Yeah, I mean, the conversation also reminds me of something David Suchere, who wrote the book City Comforts, which was one of my
Mm-hmm.
all-time favorite little books. He wrote this proposal a few years ago for Seattle, where he lives, and he just said, if we just allowed a triplex essentially on the corner lot of every residential neighborhood, then that alone would solve the housing shortage in the city
Yeah.
of Seattle. Just these kind of micro um, touches that could coordinate that with an adaptive code mindset. And it also, if you go back to where you started, if you think about the pre zoning city building world, previous to say the 1920s, that's really how we built our cities. It were just these
Right.
armies of individuals and local people. There was not there were not a whole lot of professional builders who were building all of those sort of missing middle neighborhoods all over the country.
Right. So, a major theme, I would say, underneath all of this stuff is that we used to have a culture of doing this kind of thing. It was just normal, it was just what
Yeah.
people did.
Right.
There were always new lots being sold around the edges of the town. There were always people who would take a chance, and most of them would buy a lot for their own use, you know? But there were also always people who would take a little bit of a chance and say, I'm not just going to build a tiny house for myself. I'm going to build a 2 unit and I'm going to live in the upstairs and rent out the downstairs. And other people would say, hey, I've been a successful, I've been a dentist here for a number of years. I've got some investment money I want to put somewhere, and I'm going to build a fourplex because I know there's a bunch of people who are looking for homes to rent and there's not enough of them. All those people in aggregate created Chicago. Like that's
Mhm.
the individual projects are small, the collective output is enormous, um, and so much more responsive to the real needs of the real people on the ground. Um, I want to to try and sort of tie off this idea and make sure I've left your listeners with a good description. So, determining what's allowed by surrounding conditions and succession by right. One of the succession by right, I think, is relatively easier to understand. The how do we determine what's allowed by surrounding conditions? I think there's two ideas that I would really like to see explored more. And I used to prefer the first, and now I think I prefer the second. But the first way you could think of this is like a fully parameterized succession function, which is like the Denver setback rule. So you say the setback, here's the equation for how you determine your setback. Here's the equation for how you determine your height. Here's the equation for how you determine how many units, and kind of like break down all the parameters of a project and say, like, we have kind of we have a little bit of algebra. You plug in the variables from the however many properties are around you, and then that outputs what you can do on each lot. And one thing I think is nice about that is it's like extremely responsive to local conditions. So like hyper local, the exact thing that's allowed on each lot is just a little different based on the exact surrounding conditions. I think though that the more I've chewed on this, the more I think that is maybe harder to internalize and administrate compared to where we are today, where we're sort of used to, I go to the map, I look up what's allowed from a table. I also think it's a little harder to be confident that the buildings that would come out of that would be buildings we all really like. And I think one of the things that has produced so much backlash against change in the post-war era is that we mostly build crappy buildings.
Right.
So this is like, the new urbanists have been trying to say this for a long time. Like, we need to build places that are lovely, and we can do that. It doesn't have to cost radically more, but we need to have buildings that front onto the street, not just garage doors. We need to have some of these basic architectural details. And so I think there's maybe a second approach where instead of it being completely just like individual functions for every aspect of the building that we want to govern, that we could start to say we have levels of development. And this is the transect. You think
Mhm.
of it as like level 1, level 2, level 3. And that describes a range of building types and forms at different levels of intensity. And you kind of think of it, instead of needing to calculate exactly what is allowed on all of those parameters and get sort of like a custom output for each lot, that you could just say, well, anything that fits inside these characteristics, that's level 1. And if every lot around you is level 1, then you can go to level 2, and level 2 needs to fit this formula. So the second example I gave in Denver, um, was sort of exploring that idea a little bit more. Denver has this form-based code, and they have these building typologies where they say they start with a suburban house, and then they have an urban house, then they have tandem house, then they have duplex, then they have row home. And you could say, okay, well, these like suburban and urban homes, that's level 1. And these tandem houses and duplexes, that's level 2. And these row homes, that's level 3. And so then if you're in an area that's all duplexes now, you can go up to the row home level. And what's nice about that is that I think that's like a little simpler and a little easier to understand. And I think that we have so much prior art with all the work that's been done, smart code and all the derivatives that have branched off of it, to
Mhm.
say we understand how the transect works. We understand how to sort of define what is kind of like an ensemble of buildings that together forms a certain level of development. It has a really nice character and creates a beautiful, vibrant place. And then, to be able to say you can step up one, um, makes a lot of sense. And actually, the idea of succession is baked in the smart code was supposed to have that,
Right.
and it's never actually been done.
Yeah.
So, this is not really like we're inventing something from whole cloth. This is like
Right.
trying to just connect the dots between lots of other existing ideas that we've had. But to try and say that the reason it doesn't ever quite work is because we always start from that paradigm of stasis. We always start from that paradigm of the city draws the map says what you can do, and that doesn't change unless you go through a very political process of rezoning, like
Yeah.
increasing it. And I think the idea of succession by right is so important because it stops us debating each individual project and starts focusing us on debating the rules themselves, and saying kind of we have this formula that is like a governing function that determines the rate of change in our city and the kind of change that can happen. And if we're not totally happy with the output, let's debate those rules. Let's say, okay, we went a little too, we were too liberal on, I don't know, height. We didn't, we said you could go from 1 story to 4, and then everyone did that and we didn't like it very much. So let's dial that back. 1 story can go to 2. But you're not fighting over each individual project as some kind of discretionary decision. You're sort of saying like, hey, there's this algorithm
Mm.
that guides the growth of our city, and like it helps recreate this culture of like everyone can play a part, everyone can kind of look at the formula and see like, okay, this is what I could do, this is what I could get a permit for today, and like where's the opportunity around me, where's the need in my neighborhood that's not being met, where is the you know where are the projects that this community really needs, and where can I do those. And then instead of focusing on sort of having this, okay, projects are bad, every single one of them needs to go through this arduous review, you just start to say, what is the sort of formula that's guiding growth here and guiding change and like governing change? And is that formula producing change that we really like? And if it is, then great, like we nailed it. And if not, let's tweak the formula and kind of observe and have this sort of iterative feedback loop of, projects that kind of go through this process come out good, and they come out fast, and they come out deprofessionalized, and they come out, responsive to the neighborhood. And that's what I
Yeah.
think. I don't think we could just sit down and draw this in like some theoretical model code and get it right in one iteration. I think cities would have to experiment. And so it's really more than anything, it's like a paradigm shift of saying, let's try to be a city that governs growth as a continuous, gentle, incremental evolution of the city is the expectation and what we're trying to achieve, rather than saying we have this sort of static rule set and debate every single project individually. Um, and I think if cities can sort of make that mental shift, I think we could get to a better place.
Yeah. I think that's great. I mean, going back to the form-based code days, there's so much wisdom and good work that came out of that era. But there were also, a couple of key problems, and one is you described that a lot of those I wrote a bunch of those codes. A lot of them, when they're adopted, they're really adopted with the mindset it's okay. This is the new, R2 or R1, and it's
Right.
going to be it's going to be this way forever. It's more flexible. It's a whole lot more flexible. It's based on form rules, and and we have an easier process. But it's kind of this way forever. It's not really allowed to evolve. And then the second thing was it's just one of the biggest challenges with the form-based code approach was we just had a really hard time scaling it
Mm-hmm.
to 19,000 municipalities across the country. And so maybe there's a blending of this, and who knows, maybe ChatGPT or AI will help us figure this all out and create the algorithm that really helps kind of blend these and solve it so it's something that could scale more effectively. I don't know. So
Yeah, hopefully.
open ideas on that. Um,
I do think AI will be interesting. My other life working in software uh, gives me a lot of exposure to that. But I don't think that uh, I think the scaling problem. I think the scaling problem is real.
yeah,
But what's interesting is I think the scaling problem is really downstream of the stasis first mindset,
yeah,
because you really are setting a bar that's almost impossible. I think it's impossible to hit, which is that like we need to design the whole thing up front. Like
hmm,
when you take a form-based code and then you actually combine it with a zoning map, you're actually designing the entire city.
yeah,
like, plus or minus whether the facade of that building got 3 windows or 4. Like, you're really designing the entire city and its entire future right now. And it's just too hard. You can't do that.
Yeah.
So I think there is so much wisdom in those ideas. But if you started from a paradigm of dynamism and started from a paradigm of, okay, the city is a complex adaptive system, it's going to change incrementally, constantly over time. And what we're really trying to do is to say, what are the rules about change? You know, and how is the city change over time? And that's the focus, not trying to design the whole thing ahead of time, not trying to predict exactly what will this look like in 20 years, but just saying, what is kind of that what is that increment, what does that evolution look like, how do we govern that we get this continuous evolution going and we're generally happy with the results, right? Then you have a different bar you're trying to hit, right? Then your bar is more like, can people sit down and determine exactly what they're allowed to build and get a permit in a matter of a couple days with, and when they do that, are we all happy with what came out of that? And if we're not happy, again, we'll like tweak the formula and try again. But because you're not trying to design the whole city ahead of time, you don't need to solve all the problems that you'll ever face. You just kind of need to start and then create that feedback loop of saying, we always evaluate the rules and we always kind of work on the formula, like we're working on the formula, not we're working on the individual buildings, and each
Yeah.
individual building is not quite so high stakes. And I think it's just a different way of thinking about this that I think makes the problem much more tractable.
Well, I think that's great, and I really appreciate you diving into this. I think maybe we could explore it at some point, even more down the road. It'd be interesting to hear people kind of share some tangible examples from their own community, and we could talk about how this works. So I really think there's something here. Um,
Yeah.
so, Andrew, I want to wrap now. How you have a great Substack. Do you want to direct people to that if they want to get in touch with you?
Sure, yeah. My Substack is post suburban, as in like after the suburbs, POST suburban.substack.com. I usually write once or twice a month. So if this, I'd say for anyone who thought this was interesting and you want more nerdery like this, like that's where to go.
Yeah, it's a great Substack. Very well thought out pieces. Everything from like street design to the zoning stuff to he had a great piece last week. It was about his family and just kind of search for living in a walkable place and how much harder that is than it ought to be. So
Yeah.
anyway, really cool. Well, Andrew Burleson, thanks so much for doing this. I really appreciate the time, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thanks, Kevin.